There is a city in central Mexico whose builders are unknown. Not unknown in the sense that historians have lost track of the records. Unknown in the sense that there are no records. The civilization that built Teotihuacan left no writing that has been deciphered, no king lists, no foundation myths that can be read. The city existed, grew to become the largest in the Western Hemisphere, influenced virtually every culture in Mesoamerica for centuries, and then collapsed, burned, and was abandoned, and the people who built it disappeared so completely from historical memory that when the Aztecs found the ruins centuries later they did not know who had made them. They assumed it must have been the gods. They named it Teotihuacan, the place where men become gods, or the place where the gods were born. That name is the one we use today, because we still have nothing better to offer. What we know about Teotihuacan comes from the city itself, from 6 decades of systematic archaeological excavation that have transformed it from a ruin in the Mexican highlands into one of the most thoroughly investigated ancient sites in the world. We know when it was built, roughly, and when it fell. We know how large it was, and how it was organized, and something about how its inhabitants lived and what they believed. We know it was cosmopolitan, drawing migrants from across Mesoamerica who lived in distinct neighborhoods and maintained their own cultural traditions within the larger city. We know it was powerful enough to project its influence as far as the Maya lowlands 1,000 kilometers to the south, where Teotihuacan warrior imagery and Teotihuacan-style artifacts appear at major Maya sites in the 4th and 5th centuries as evidence of military or political intervention. We know it burned, deliberately, its most important buildings set on fire in the 7th century by persons unknown, and that after the burning it was never again the power it had been. What we do not know is who the builders were, what they called themselves, what language they spoke, what stories they told about the origin of their city and the meaning of the enormous structures at its heart. The silence at the center of Teotihuacan is the silence of a civilization that either did not write or whose writing has not been found, and it gives the city a quality of mystery that no amount of archaeological investigation has been able to fully dispel. The specific timing of the city's emergence is itself significant. The centuries around the turn of the Common Era were a period of significant upheaval in the basin of Mexico, when the volcano Popocatépetl erupted with sufficient force to bury the major city of Coahuilco under lava and ash, displacing its population and redirecting the demographic and political energies of the basin. Some researchers have proposed that the refugees from Coahuilco and its region were among the founding population of Teotihuacan, their displacement creating both the population pressure and the political vacuum that allowed the new city to grow rapidly to unprecedented scale. Whether or not this specific connection holds, the timing of Teotihuacan's growth, beginning in earnest in the 1st century BCE and accelerating through the 1st century CE, coincides with a period of major political reorganization in the basin. Teotihuacan was built in the valley of Teotihuacan, a narrow highland valley that opens off the northeastern corner of the broader basin of Mexico, at an elevation of approximately 2,300 meters above sea level. The Basin of Mexico, the broad highland basin surrounded by volcanic mountains that today contains Mexico City and its surrounding urban sprawl, was already in the 1st century BCE one of the most densely populated regions in Mesoamerica, its fertile soils and its permanent lakes supporting agricultural populations of considerable size. The specific choice of the Teotihuacan Valley as the site for the new city, rather than the more fertile and more central parts of the basin, was probably related to the presence there of permanent springs and of the obsidian deposits in the nearby hills at Pachuca, whose high-quality volcanic glass was one of the most valuable raw materials in Mesoamerica and whose control and processing gave Teotihuacan a significant economic advantage over its rivals. The speed of the city's growth in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era was remarkable even by the standards of the ancient world. Archaeological evidence suggests that the population reached 50,000 or more within a few centuries of the city's founding, drawn by the economic opportunities of a rapidly expanding commercial center and the religious prestige of a site that was apparently understood, from its earliest phases, as a place of exceptional sacred significance. The planning of the grid system and the construction of the Pyramid of the Sun, which was built in a single construction phase rather than accumulated over generations, implies that the founding vision of the city as a cosmological center organized around the Street of the Dead axis was present from the beginning rather than emerging gradually. Someone or some group had a plan for Teotihuacan before the city existed, and the execution of that plan over the following centuries was one of the most ambitious acts of urban design in the history of the ancient Americas. The physical scale of Teotihuacan at its height, in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, was extraordinary by any measure of the ancient world. The city covered an area of approximately 20 square kilometers, organized on a grid plan that was one of the most ambitious acts of urban design in the ancient Americas. The grid was not merely a practical organizing device but a cosmological statement. Its principal axis, the great north-south thoroughfare that the Aztecs called the Street of the Dead, oriented 15.5 degrees east of true north in an alignment that corresponds to the setting point of the Pleiades star cluster on specific dates that were significant in Mesoamerican astronomical calendars. The east-west axis was perpendicular to this, creating a coordinate system that divided the city into 4 quadrants and that served as the organizing framework for the placement of every major structure. The grid was then extended outward from the city center for kilometers in all directions, organizing not just the urban core but the agricultural hinterland and the satellite settlements of the wider Teotihuacan state within a single geometric system that expressed the city's claim to have organized the cosmos around itself. At the height of its occupation, the city housed between 100,000 and 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world in the 4th century CE, comparable to Rome and Alexandria and the great cities of Han Dynasty China. The population density within the urban core was extraordinary, the city accommodating this enormous population within its 20 square kilometers through a system of apartment compounds, large rectangular complexes of interconnected rooms surrounding central courtyards that served as the primary residential unit for most of the city's inhabitants. More than 2,000 of these apartment compounds have been identified within the city, each one housing between 20 and 100 individuals in a complex that combined residential, craft production, and ritual functions within a single enclosed space. The apartment compound was the social unit of Teotihuacan life, the place where people were born, where they worked, where they worshipped, and where they were buried, in tombs cut into the floors of the rooms they had inhabited in life. The specific spatial organization of the city communicates a great deal about the values and the priorities of the civilization that built it. The monumental core, with its pyramids and its processional avenue and its great plazas, occupies a central position that gave it visual dominance over the residential districts that surrounded it, and the sight lines from the major public spaces were clearly managed to create specific visual effects. The Street of the Dead scene from the Pyramid of the Moon summit, with its platforms receding into the distance and the Pyramid of the Sun visible on the right horizon, is a composition of extraordinary spatial power that could only have been achieved by deliberate design. The city was built to be experienced as a total visual environment, and the experience of moving through it in antiquity, when the buildings were still plastered white and painted in bright pigments, would have been an experience of total immersion in a built world that expressed a specific cosmological vision through every element of its design. The relationship between the city center and its residential periphery also reflects specific social values. The roughly circular distribution of apartment compounds around the ceremonial core, with the most elaborate and the best supplied compounds closest to the center and simpler and less well-provisioned compounds toward the edges, suggests a spatial expression of social hierarchy in which proximity to the sacred center was both a reflection of and a reinforcement for social status. The elite families who lived in the largest compounds closest to the pyramids were not simply wealthier than their neighbors in the outer rings. They were physically closer to the divine power that the pyramids embodied and the specific quality of their daily visual environment, looking out from their compound courtyards at the pyramid profiles visible above the city's roofscape, was a constant reinforcement of their privileged relationship to the sacred order that the city expressed. The monumental core, with its pyramids and its processional avenue and its great plazas, occupies a central position that gave it visual dominance over the residential districts that surrounded it, and the sight lines from the major public spaces were clearly managed to create specific visual effects. The Street of the Dead scene from the Pyramid of the Moon summit, with its platforms receding into the distance and the Pyramid of the Sun visible on the right horizon, is a composition of extraordinary spatial power that could only have been achieved by deliberate design. The city was built to be experienced as a total visual environment, and the experience of moving through it in antiquity, when the buildings were still plastered white and painted in bright pigments, would have been an experience of total immersion in a built world that expressed a specific cosmological vision through every element of its design. The agricultural and economic infrastructure that supported this urban population was substantial and sophisticated. The city sat astride the most important obsidian trade routes in Mesoamerica, and the processing and distribution of obsidian from the nearby Pachuca deposits, whose distinctive green-tinged volcanic glass is recognizable at sites across a vast region, was a significant component of the Teotihuacan economy. The city also processed and distributed other materials, ceramics, including the distinctive thin orange where that is a marker of Teotihuacan commercial reach, and the specific craft goods that were produced by the specialist artisans who lived in the apartment compounds and whose work sustained the trade networks that supplied the city with food and raw materials in exchange for its manufactured products. The Pyramid of the Sun is the defining monument of Teotihuacan and one of the largest structures built by human hands anywhere in the ancient world. It stands on the east side of the Street of the Dead, approximately in the center of the city's main ceremonial precinct, its base measuring approximately 220 meters on each side and its original height estimated at approximately 65 meters, somewhat reduced from the original by centuries of erosion and by the damage done by a misguided early 20th century restoration that stripped the outer facing and left the structure somewhat lower than it had been. The volume of the Pyramid of the Sun is comparable to the Great Pyramid of Giza, though its lower profile makes it appear smaller for most viewing angles, and its construction required the movement and placement of approximately 1 million cubic meters of fill material, a labor investment that represents millions of person-days of coordinated effort. The construction sequence of the Pyramid of the Sun reveals that it was not built all at once but grew in successive stages, each new phase encasing the previous structure in a new layer of fill and facing. This pattern of constructive elaboration, in which each generation added to and enlarged the monuments of the previous generation, is characteristic of Mesoamerican pyramidal architecture and reflects a specifically Mesoamerican understanding of sacred architecture as a living thing that accumulated power with each successive addition. The energy invested in each construction phase, and the specific ritual deposits associated with each stage, created a layered record of the city's religious history that archaeological excavation can partially recover. The pyramid was built over a natural cave that was discovered by archaeologists in 1971, a lava tube that extends approximately 100 meters into the bedrock beneath the structure and that terminates in a cloverleaf-shaped chamber whose 4 lobes correspond to the cardinal directions. The cave was clearly known and venerated before the pyramid was built over it, and the alignment of the entire pyramid and the street system of the city was apparently organized around this natural feature rather than the pyramid being placed arbitrarily and the cave discovered afterward. In Mesoamerican religious thought, caves were understood as entrances to the underworld and as places of creation, where the first humans had emerged from the earth at the beginning of the current cosmic era. The placement of the largest pyramid in the Western Hemisphere over a cave that was understood as a place of origin was not incidental but was the founding religious act of the entire city, the physical expression of a claim that Teotihuacan was the place where the current world had begun. The Pyramid of the Moon, which stands at the northern end of the Street of the Dead and closes the perspective of that great axis with its profile set against the backdrop of Cerro Gordo, the extinct volcano that rises behind it, is somewhat smaller than the Pyramid of the Sun but archaeologically richer in the evidence it has produced for the ritual life of the city. The excavations conducted by Mexican and Japanese archaeologists in the Moon Pyramid project from 1998 onward have revealed a complex sequence of construction phases, with each successive enlargement of the pyramid associated with elaborate dedicatory offerings that included the remains of sacrificed humans and animals, greenstone and obsidian objects of high ritual value, and the specific categories of material that the Teotihuacan ritual system associated with warfare, fertility, and the maintenance of cosmic order. The sacrificed individuals were not all local. Isotopic analysis of their bone chemistry has shown that some came from distant parts of Mesoamerica, suggesting that sacrificial victims were obtained through the military and commercial networks that connected Teotihuacan to the wider Mesoamerican world. The non-local origin of some sacrificial victims in the Moon Pyramid deposits is one of several lines of evidence that Teotihuacan was not simply a regional power, but a city whose reach extended across the Mesoamerican world in ways that brought human beings as well as goods to its ritual centers. The specific categories of individuals sacrificed: adult males in military attire with bound hands, who represent a standard category of sacrifice associated with warfare and captive-taking in Mesoamerican tradition, suggest that the sacrificial program of the major pyramids was connected to the military activities of the city, and that the victims were captives taken in warfare or tribute demands from subject communities. The repeated use of human sacrifice as the dedicatory offering for each successive construction phase of the pyramid, spanning a period of several centuries, indicates that this practice was not an emergency measure or an aberration, but a consistent and institutionalized element of the Teotihuacan ritual calendar. The Street of the Dead, the great axis of Teotihuacan that runs for more than 4 kilometers through the ceremonial heart of the city, is one of the most impressive pieces of urban design in the ancient world, and walking it today gives a direct experience of the spatial intelligence that organized this extraordinary city. The street is not actually a street in the conventional sense. It is a series of elevated platforms connected by stairways, creating a processional way that rises and descends in controlled increments as it passes through the ceremonial complex. The visual effect, particularly when approached from the south, is of a sequence of framed views in which each successive platform level reveals a new section of the great axis leading toward the Pyramid of the Moon at its northern terminus, with the pyramid's profile aligned against the mountain behind it in a composition that was clearly deliberate. The specific geometry of this view, the alignment of the street, the pyramid, and the mountain, creates a visual sequence that is one of the most carefully designed spatial experiences in Mesoamerican architecture, a choreographed approach to the sacred center of the city that controlled the visual and physical experience of all who moved through it. The processional character of the Street of the Dead raises the question of what kinds of ceremonial events moved along it in antiquity. The major ritual calendar of Mesoamerica, which organized time into a series of overlapping cycles of different lengths, prescribed specific ceremonies for specific dates that would have involved the entire population of the city in ways that required large public spaces. The great plazas at the bases of the pyramids and along the Street of the Dead could accommodate tens of thousands of people simultaneously, and the specific spatial organization of the ceremonial core, with its carefully controlled approaches and its elevated platforms that separated ritual performers from the watching crowds, reflects the requirements of a ceremonial system in which public ritual was both a religious necessity and a political performance. Along the Street of the Dead, in addition to the pyramids of the Sun and Moon, stood a series of temples and platforms whose specific identities and dedications are largely unknown, but whose scale and careful placement within the overall grid plan indicate that they were major ritual structures serving specific functions in the ceremonial life of the city. The Ciudadela, a massive enclosed precinct at the south end of the ceremonial core that contained the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, is the most imposing of these secondary complexes and may have been the administrative and residential center of whatever authority governed the city, the closest thing to a palace that Teotihuacan possesses, though its specific political function is debated. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent, the main structure within the Ciudadela, is the most elaborately decorated building in Teotihuacan, its facade covered with alternating heads of the feathered serpent that would become the god Quetzalcoatl of later Mesoamerican tradition and a goggle-eyed deity associated with rain and water whose identity is contested among scholars. The temple was dedicated with one of the largest sacrificial deposits found anywhere at the site. More than 200 individuals, mostly adult males in military attire with their hands tied behind their backs, were killed and interred in pits surrounding the structure. These sacrifices were not sporadic or incidental, but were a single coordinated ceremony of extraordinary scale, a founding sacrifice that consecrated the temple and whose specific meaning and occasion are among the most discussed questions in Teotihuacan archaeology. The feathered serpent imagery that gives the temple its modern name connects it to one of the most persistent and most widely distributed supernatural beings in Mesoamerican religious tradition. The feathered serpent, the creature that combines the earthly power of the serpent with the celestial attributes of the Quetzal bird, appeared at Teotihuacan in the form that would eventually develop into the god Quetzalcoatl of the Aztec tradition, and the specific iconographic program of the temple facade, with its alternating serpent heads framed by feather collars and goggle-eyed deity faces, created a visual statement about the relationship between sky and earth, between water and fire, between the creative and the destructive dimensions of the cosmos that was one of the fundamental theological expressions of the Teotihuacan religious tradition. The decision to decorate the city's most politically significant building with this imagery, and to dedicate it with the largest single sacrifice in the city's history, suggests that the feathered serpent held a place in the Teotihuacan pantheon of particular significance for political authority and cosmic order. The murals of Teotihuacan are the most direct window available into the religious and cosmological world of the city's inhabitants, and the program of imagery they contain, spread across the walls of apartment compounds and temples across the site, constitutes one of the richest collections of ancient Mesoamerican religious art in existence. The murals were painted in a distinctive style that is one of the most immediately recognizable in all of Mesoamerican art. Flat, two-dimensional figures rendered in outline with areas of solid color, arranged in registers that read across the wall surface in processional sequences. The dominant colors are red, black, and yellow, applied over a white lime plaster ground, and the specific pigments used were durable enough that many of the murals that have been excavated in the last century survive in states of reasonable preservation. The subject matter ranges from the depictions of deities and ritual performers that dominate the ceremonial buildings to the more intimate scenes of everyday and ceremonial life that appear in the apartment compound murals, and the combination of these two registers gives a picture of the Teotihuacan visual world that is more complete than that available for most ancient civilizations of comparable antiquity. The most frequently depicted figure in the Teotihuacan murals is the Great Goddess, a female deity whose iconography includes net skirts, jade ornaments, feathered headdresses, and the specific combination of symbols associated with water, fertility, seeds, and the abundance of the earth. She appears in dozens of murals across the site, often in a frontal, hieratic pose with streams of water and symbolic objects flowing from her outstretched hands, and her ubiquity in the decorative program suggests that she was the primary deity of the Teotihuacan pantheon, at least as far as public religious expression was concerned. Whether the Great Goddess was understood as a single unified deity or as a cluster of related female divine powers, and what specific myths and ceremonies were associated with her cult, are questions that the mural evidence raises but cannot fully answer in the absence of accompanying texts. The storm god, whose goggle eyes and lightning bolts connect him to the later Tlaloc of Aztec tradition, appears alongside the Great Goddess in many contexts and seems to have been her male counterpart in the Teotihuacan divine pantheon, associated with rain, lightning, and the sacrificial dimension of the fertility cycle. Together, the storm god and the Great Goddess organized the cosmological world of Teotihuacan around the twin axes of water and fertility on one hand and warfare and sacrifice on the other, a duality that was fundamental to Mesoamerican religious thought and that the Teotihuacan tradition expressed with a specific visual vocabulary that influenced religious art across the region for centuries. The apartment compound murals include subjects that are more intimate in scale, depicting processions of priests or deity impersonators, animals with symbolic significance, and the specific ceremonies of the ritual calendar that organized the year for Teotihuacan's inhabitants. The clay figurines produced in enormous quantities by the city's craft workers represent a different dimension of the religious life of the compounds, one that is more personal and more varied than the official iconographic program of the murals. The figurines depict a wide range of subjects, including human figures in various dress and postures, composite human-animal beings, and representations of deities and supernatural entities, and their specific forms reflect the individual religious preferences and ritual needs of the households that commissioned and used them. The production of figurines for household use, as opposed to the formal mural programs that expressed the official religious ideology of the compound, suggests a layer of personal and family-level religious practice that coexisted with the more public ceremonial life of the city, and that gave individuals and families a way of engaging with the supernatural that was not mediated by the official institutional religion of the pyramids and the temples. The Teotihuacan compound is particularly notable for a large mural depicting what appears to be a paradise landscape, with small human figures engaged in various activities around a mountain from which water flows, interpreted by some scholars as a representation of the afterlife paradise associated with the great goddess, and by others as a more earthly scene of ceremonial activity. The Atelco and Zacuala compounds contain processional murals of coyotes, jaguars, and eagles that combine naturalistic animal representation with symbolic attributes in ways that connect the natural world to the sacred in the characteristic manner of Mesoamerican thought. The population of Teotihuacan was not ethnically or culturally homogeneous, and the evidence for the presence of distinct ethnic and regional groups within the city is one of the most significant recent developments in the understanding of the city's character. The excavation of specific neighborhoods within the city has revealed residential areas that contain material culture clearly associated with other Mesoamerican regions, indicating the presence of distinct ethnic communities that maintained their own cultural traditions within the larger urban framework. The Teotihuacan barrio, a neighborhood on the western edge of the city whose residents practice the Teotihuacan custom of urn burial and whose ceramic assemblage includes quantities of material in Teotihuacan styles, is the best documented of these ethnic neighborhoods, but similar evidence has been found for communities of Gulf Coast origin and possibly Maya origin as well. These communities were not simply temporary commercial enclaves but permanent residential neighborhoods, inhabited across multiple generations and maintaining their distinct cultural identities over long periods. The craft workers who lived in these compound neighborhoods were not slaves or captives but specialist artisans who had chosen to live in the city, or whose ancestors had done so, and whose economic survival depended on the maintenance of the commercial networks through which their products were distributed. The specific goods produced in the craft neighborhoods, including the obsidian tools, the ceramic vessels, and the lapidary objects that have been found in quantities far exceeding local consumption in the archaeological deposits, were the material basis of the city's commercial reach and the foundation of its ability to obtain the diverse raw materials and luxury goods from across Mesoamerica that sustained its population and its religious life. The presence of these ethnic neighborhoods is evidence for the cosmopolitan character of Teotihuacan and for the mechanisms through which the city maintained its position as the dominant urban center of Mesoamerica. The ability to attract and retain migrants from across the region, to provide conditions in which distinct cultural communities could maintain their identities while participating in the economic and social life of the larger city, is a characteristic of successful pre-modern cities everywhere in the world. And Teotihuacan's success in doing this over several centuries is one of the factors that explains its extraordinary demographic size. The specific mechanisms of attraction, whether economic opportunity, religious prestige, political coercion, or some combination of all three, are not fully documented but can be inferred from the evidence of the city's economic dominance and religious centrality. The question of how Teotihuacan was governed is one of the most actively debated in the scholarship of the site, and unlike many ancient urban civilizations, Teotihuacan provides frustratingly little direct evidence for its political structure. There are no inscriptions that identify kings, no royal tombs that display the wealth and power of individual rulers in the way that Maya royal burials do, no palaces that obviously served as the residence of a supreme authority. The Ciudadela has been proposed as a palace complex, and specific individuals identified in dedicatory contexts and in the murals have been proposed as rulers, but the evidence is indirect and the scholarly consensus remains genuinely uncertain. Some researchers have proposed a collective or oligarchic model of governance, in which power was shared among a group of elite lineages rather than concentrated in a single royal figure, and this model is consistent with the relative absence of ruler-glorifying imagery that distinguishes Teotihuacan from contemporary Maya cities. What is clear is that some authority was capable of organizing the construction of the major monuments, the planning of the grid city, and the coordination of the sacrificial rituals that dedicated the major structures, whether that authority was a single ruler, a collective elite, or a theocratic institution of some kind. The absence of ruler-glorifying imagery at Teotihuacan is one of the most striking differences between this city and the contemporary Maya civilizations to the south, where the identification of individual rulers with specific monuments is the fundamental organizing principle of the archaeological record. At Maya sites, the construction of a pyramid or a palace is inseparable from the identity of the ruler who commissioned it, and the inscriptions that accompany major structures celebrate the king's achievements, his genealogy, and his divine connections. At Teotihuacan, no comparable tradition of ruler identification exists, and the major monuments speak in the name of the gods and the cosmic order rather than in the name of the specific individuals who built them. Whether this reflects a genuinely different political philosophy, in which the individual ruler was subordinated to a theocratic system that emphasized cosmic order over personal power, or simply a different convention of self-presentation that expressed personal power through religious language rather than direct assertion, is a question that the available evidence cannot definitively resolve. The relationship between Teotihuacan and the Maya world to the south is one of the most consequential and most debated interactions in the history of ancient Mesoamerica, involving the largest urban power in the region and the civilization whose written records give us our clearest window into what actually happened. The evidence for Teotihuacan presence at Maya sites is substantial and appears in multiple forms. Teotihuacan-style ceramics, architecture in the talud tablero style that is the hallmark of Teotihuacan monumental building, and most dramatically, carved inscriptions at several Maya sites that appear to record the arrival of individuals associated with Teotihuacan and the subsequent establishment of new ruling dynasties. The most specific and most discussed of these events is dated in the Maya long count calendar to January 16, 378 CE, when an individual referred to in the inscriptions as Teotihuacan, fire is born, arrived at the Maya city of Tikal, and an existing Maya king died on the same day. A new ruler associated with Teotihuacan was installed, and similar events appear to have occurred at other Maya cities in the same period, suggesting a coordinated intervention rather than an isolated incident. The material evidence for Teotihuacan's presence in the Maya world takes several specific forms that have been extensively analyzed in recent decades. The talud tablero architectural style, in which a sloping lower panel is topped by a vertical upper panel in a distinctive double profile that is the hallmark of Teotihuacan monumental construction, appears at Maya sites including Tikal and Copan in forms that cannot be explained by independent invention and that clearly reflect direct contact with the Teotihuacan architectural tradition. The green obsidian from the Pachuca source near Teotihuacan appears at Maya sites in quantities that require the existence of deliberate long-distance distribution rather than casual exchange. And the specific iconographic elements associated with Teotihuacan warfare and political power, including the atlotl dart thrower and the characteristic mosaic headdress of Teotihuacan warrior imagery, appear in Maya art at precisely the period when the textual evidence for Teotihuacan political intervention is concentrated. Whether this intervention was a military conquest, a diplomatic installation of client rulers, or a complex of events that does not map neatly onto any simple category of political action is a question that scholars continue to debate. The Maya texts describe these events from a Maya perspective and encode them in the specific political language of Maya royal inscriptions, which are not transparent historical documents but carefully constructed ideological statements designed to legitimate the authority of the rulers who commissioned them. What can be said with confidence is that the presence of Teotihuacan political influence at Tikal and other Maya sites in the late 4th and early 5th centuries is real, that it was associated with significant changes in the political structures of the affected Maya polities, and that it represents the most direct evidence for Teotihuacan's exercise of power beyond the basin of Mexico. The nature of the longer-term relationship between Teotihuacan and the Maya is more diffuse but no less significant. Teotihuacan material culture, artistic motifs, and religious iconography appear throughout the Maya region in the Classic period, incorporated into Maya art and architecture in ways that reflect deep cultural engagement rather than superficial borrowing. The specific elements of Teotihuacan religious iconography that appear in Maya contexts, including the storm god imagery, the feathered serpent, and the specific costumes and weapons associated with Teotihuacan warrior imagery, were transformed by their Maya adopters into new configurations that combine Teotihuacan forms with Maya meanings, producing a syncretic tradition that reflects the complex cultural interactions of two great civilizations in sustained contact. The specific case of Copan, the Maya city in what is now Honduras, illustrates the complexity of this engagement. The founding dynasty of Copan's Classic period, whose lineage is traced in the royal inscriptions to the figure known as Kinich Yaxcook Mo, shows deep Teotihuacan associations in the founder's tomb, which contains offerings of Teotihuacan-style ceramics and personal ornaments that connect him to the central Mexican tradition. Whether Yaxcook Mo was himself from Teotihuacan, or was a local leader who adopted Teotihuacan cultural affiliations to legitimize his authority, or was installed by Teotihuacan political intervention, is debated, but the Teotihuacan associations in his burial are undeniable and suggest that the prestige of Teotihuacan was a resource that Maya rulers deployed in the construction of their own political legitimacy across a wide region. The obsidian economy of Teotihuacan was the material foundation of the city's commercial dominance, and the specific geology of the region gave the city an economic advantage that was fundamental to its rise and its maintenance of power. Obsidian, the volcanic glass formed by the rapid cooling of silica-rich lava, was the most valued cutting material in Mesoamerica in the absence of metal technology, and its physical properties, its ability to be knapped into blades of extraordinary sharpness, its hardness, and the specific colors and textures of different geological sources that made high-quality varieties immediately recognizable as prestige materials, gave it a dual role as both a practical tool material and a luxury good. The Pachuca obsidian source in the hills east of the Teotihuacan Valley produced a distinctive green-tinted material of exceptional quality that was the most sought-after obsidian in Mesoamerica, and Teotihuacan's control of access to this source, combined with its development of the processing and distribution infrastructure to exploit it at scale, was one of the primary mechanisms through which the city established and maintained its commercial dominance. The obsidian workshops of Teotihuacan, whose remains have been found in specific neighborhoods within the city, operated at a scale of production that was far beyond household or community needs, producing quantities of blades and points that could only have been intended for distribution across the long-distance trade networks that connected Teotihuacan to the rest of Mesoamerica. The specific distribution of Pachuca obsidian across Mesoamerica, documented by the chemical fingerprinting technique that identifies obsidian specimens from their trace element signatures, is one of the clearest material markers of Teotihuacan's commercial reach, appearing at sites from the Gulf Coast to the highlands of Guatemala in quantities that reflect systematic commercial distribution rather than casual exchange. The specific scale of Teotihuacan's obsidian industry, which has been estimated from the quantities of debitage found in the workshop neighborhoods, was extraordinary by any standard of pre-modern craft production. The workshops produced not only the utilitarian blade cores and finished blades that were the workhorse of Mesoamerican cutting technology, but also the elaborate projectile points and eccentrics, obsidian objects worked into non-utilitarian forms of considerable technical virtuosity, that served as prestige goods in the elite exchange networks. The combination of mass production for the utilitarian market and specialist production for the luxury market within a single urban craft tradition is characteristic of a sophisticated commercial economy, and the management of this dual production system, ensuring the supply of raw material, the training of workers at different skill levels, and the distribution of the finished product through the appropriate channels was one of the primary organizational challenges of the Teotihuacan economic system. The wider commercial networks that Teotihuacan participated in moved not only obsidian but the full range of valuable goods that circulated in the Mesoamerican world: cacao, jade, pyrite mirrors, marine shells, feathers of tropical birds, and the specific categories of ceramic goods, particularly the thin orange pottery produced in the Teotihuacan region and distributed through Teotihuacan networks, that served as prestige markers across a vast area. The apartment compounds of Teotihuacan were the production centers for much of this craft output and the specific organization of craft production within the city, with evidence for both neighborhood-level specialization and household-level diversity within neighborhoods, reflects the sophisticated economic organization of a city whose commercial reach extended across Mesoamerica. The thin orange pottery that served as a marker of Teotihuacan commercial reach across the Mesoamerican region deserves specific attention as one of the clearest material traces of the city's economic system. Thin orange is not actually produced at Teotihuacan itself, but at sites in the Teotihuacan Valley to the southeast, yet its distribution across Mesoamerica is closely correlated with the distribution of Teotihuacan influence, suggesting that the city controlled the distribution of this pottery rather than its production. The specific mechanism of this control, whether through the organization of a distribution network centered on Teotihuacan merchants, through the collection of thin orange as tribute from the producing region and its redistribution through Teotihuacan commercial channels, or through some other arrangement, is not fully documented. But the pattern of distribution itself is clear evidence of a commercial system sophisticated enough to separate the production of a commodity from its distribution, and to organize that distribution across a vast geographic area. The daily life of the inhabitants of Teotihuacan's apartment compounds was shaped by the specific spatial and social organization of those structures, which were both the primary residential unit and the primary social unit of the city's population. The typical apartment compound was a rectangular enclosure of roughly 50 to 60 meters on a side, containing a cluster of interconnected rooms and open courtyards that housed a group of related families sharing common residential, economic, and ritual activities. The rooms were built of stone and lime plaster, their walls often covered with painted murals of religious subjects that established the specific ritual identity of the compound and the family or lineage group that inhabited it. The central courtyard, the primary shared space of the compound, contained a small altar or temple that served the religious needs of the compound's inhabitants, and that was the focus of the regular ritual activities that marked the Mesoamerican calendar. The specific deities honored at the compound altar, and the specific ritual practices associated with them, varied between compounds in ways that may reflect the different ethnic backgrounds or occupational specializations of the resident families. The burials under the floors of the apartment compounds are among the most important sources of information about the lives of ordinary Teotihuacanos, preserving the physical remains of the city's population in contexts that allow analysis of health, diet, age at death, and the social relationships between individuals in the same compound. The isotopic analysis of the bone chemistry of compound burials has produced evidence of significant dietary variation between individuals, with some showing the isotopic signatures of high-protein diets that include significant quantities of meat, while others show the maize-dominated diet of the majority of the population. The presence of non-local individuals in some compound burials, identified by isotopic signatures that reflect childhood spent in other parts of Mesoamerica, is consistent with the ethnic diversity visible in the material culture and confirms that some apartment compounds housed populations that included first-generation migrants alongside multi-generational city residents. The evidence for communal feasting in the archaeological record of the apartment compounds is one of the more informative aspects of the social life of the city. The specific distribution of food preparation and consumption debris, the grinding stones, the cooking vessels, the animal bones with cut marks indicating butchering, across the different spaces of the compound suggests a pattern of shared food preparation and communal eating that extended beyond the individual family unit to the compound as a whole. The regular communal feasts associated with the ritual calendar, in which the compound's inhabitants gathered to mark the significant days of the Mesoamerican calendar with specific foods and specific ritual performances, were as much social events as religious ones, occasions for the reinforcement of the social bonds that held the compound community together and for the display of the compound's prosperity and its connection to the wider ceremonial life of the city. The health of the Teotihuacan population, as revealed by the skeletal evidence from compound burials, was mixed. The evidence for nutritional stress, visible in the indicators of growth interruption preserved in bone and dental enamel, suggests that episodes of food shortage were not uncommon, particularly among the lower levels of the social hierarchy. The evidence for violence, including healed and unhealed traumatic injuries on skeletal remains, suggests that life in the densely packed apartment compounds of a city of this size was not free from the interpersonal conflict that urban crowding generates. The average life expectancy was not high by modern standards, but it was not dramatically lower than that of contemporary agricultural populations elsewhere in the world, and the specific patterns of disease and injury visible in the skeletal record reflect the specific conditions of urban life in a subtropical highland environment at the beginning of the Common Era. The organization of craft production within the apartment compounds was one of the fundamental economic activities of the city, and the specific distributions of craft debris, the waste materials from the production of obsidian tools, ceramic vessels, figurines, and other manufactured goods, allow the mapping of production activities across the city and the identification of neighborhoods specialized in specific crafts. The figurine production, that is one of the most abundant categories of craft debris in Teotihuacan, is particularly informative. The thousands of small clay figurines found in domestic contexts across the city reflecting a tradition of household ritual that gave material form to the specific religious beliefs and social values of the city's inhabitants. The water system of Teotihuacan is one of the less celebrated but more remarkable technical achievements of the city, reflecting the sophisticated management of scarce water resources in a highland environment with a pronounced seasonal pattern of rainfall. The valley of Teotihuacan receives most of its annual rainfall in the summer months, with a pronounced dry season from October through May that required careful management of water storage and distribution to maintain the city's population through the months when rain did not fall. The springs in the valley floor, which were the primary source of permanent water, were augmented by a system of channels and reservoirs that collected and stored rainfall during the wet season and distributed it through the city as needed. The specific engineering of this system, including the channels that ran beneath the Street of the Dead and distributed water to different parts of the ceremonial core, is one of the more technically sophisticated achievements of ancient Mesoamerican hydraulic engineering. The agricultural systems that supported the city's population made use of the same water management infrastructure on a larger scale, with irrigated agriculture in the valley floor supplemented by rainfall agriculture on the surrounding hillsides. The chinampas, the floating gardens built on the shallow lake beds of the Basin of Mexico, may have been used at Teotihuacan itself and were certainly used in the wider basin to increase agricultural productivity beyond what the irrigated valley floor alone could supply. The specific organization of the agricultural hinterland, the management of the relationships between the urban center and the farming communities that supplied it with food, is an aspect of the Teotihuacan system that is less fully documented than the urban archaeology, but that was as fundamental to the functioning of the city as the monuments and the obsidian workshops. The environmental changes associated with Teotihuacan's long occupation of the Valley of Mexico were significant and, in the long term, contributed to the difficulties the city faced in its later centuries. The deforestation of the surrounding hills, driven by the enormous demand for fuel for lime burning and for construction timber, progressively degraded the watersheds that supplied the city's water and increased the erosion that silted the irrigation channels and reduced the productivity of the agricultural land. The evidence for environmental stress in the pollen record and the sediment cores from lakes in the basin documents a progressive modification of the natural landscape that had significant consequences for the sustainability of the intensive agriculture that fed the city. The specific combination of population pressure, resource depletion, and the climatic variability of the 6th and 7th centuries that created conditions of periodic drought was the environmental context within which the social and political stresses that eventually produced the collapse developed. The management of the basin's lake system was another dimension of the Teotihuacan environmental challenge. The Basin of Mexico in antiquity contained a series of interconnected lakes whose combined area was more than 1,000 square kilometers, and the management of these lakes, their water levels, their drainage, the control of the flooding that the seasonal rains could produce, was a significant engineering and administrative challenge for any power that sought to exploit the full agricultural potential of the basin. The chinampas, the raised field systems that converted shallow lake beds into highly productive agricultural land, were one of the most productive agricultural innovations in the pre-Columbian Americas, and their development and management required the kind of coordinated collective labor that only a substantial political authority could organize. Whether Teotihuacan directly administered the chinampa zones in the southern parts of the basin, or whether those zones were managed by separate communities within the Teotihuacan sphere of influence, is a question that the current evidence does not fully resolve. The volcanic geology of the region also provided building materials of extraordinary quality. The abundant tezontle, a light and porous volcanic stone that was easy to cut and shape but durable enough for construction purposes, was the primary building material of Teotihuacan, used for everything from the fill of the Great Pyramids to the walls of the apartment compounds. The lime plaster that covered virtually every built surface in the city was produced by burning limestone in kilns, whose fuel demands contributed significantly to the deforestation of the surrounding hills, and the progressive degradation of the local environment that accompanied the city's long occupation was one of the factors that eventually contributed to its difficulties. The collapse of Teotihuacan, which occurred in the 7th century CE after approximately 6 centuries of urban occupation, is one of the great events of ancient Mesoamerican history, and its causes are as debated as the origins of the city itself. The archaeological evidence for the collapse is concentrated in the mid-7th century, when the city's major monuments and administrative buildings show evidence of deliberate burning. The fires were not the product of enemy attack in the conventional sense. There is no evidence of widespread destruction of residential areas, no mass casualties, no sudden abandonment of the domestic spaces that housed the city's population. What burned was the ceremonial core, the temples and the administrative buildings along the Street of the Dead, the compound that has been identified as the probable residence of the city's governing elite. The selectivity of the burning, targeting the symbolic and administrative heart of the city while leaving the residential compounds of the general population apparently intact, is one of the most discussed aspects of the collapse and has led many scholars to interpret it as an internal revolt rather than an external conquest. The internal revolt hypothesis sees the collapse as the product of accumulated grievances among the city's general population, directed against the elite that had governed the city and extracted tribute from the surrounding region for centuries. The evidence for social stress in the period before the collapse includes signs of declining agricultural productivity, possible climate deterioration in the 6th and 7th centuries that reduced rainfall and increased the precariousness of the city's food supply, and the symbolic dimension of deliberately burning the buildings most associated with elite power and religious authority. A population that had been subject to the demands of an exploitative elite, and that found itself facing food insecurity in a period of environmental stress, might have directed its anger specifically at the physical embodiment of that elite's power. The external pressure hypothesis, which has gained support from evidence of increased conflict and population movement across Mesoamerica in the 7th century, proposes that the collapse was triggered or accelerated by the actions of northern groups, the Shishimec peoples of the semi-arid north, who were expanding southward under pressure from drought in their own territories and who may have disrupted the trade networks and the tribute systems on which Teotihuacan depended. The evidence for northern disruption of Teotihuacan's commercial networks is present in the ceramic record, which shows a decline in the distribution of Teotihuacan-associated materials across Mesoamerica in the late 6th and 7th centuries, suggesting that the commercial system was already under stress before the final burning. The legacy of the collapse for the subsequent history of Mesoamerica was as significant as the city's rise. The dispersal of Teotihuacan's population across the basin and beyond created a diaspora of people carrying Teotihuacan cultural and religious traditions into new contexts, and the influence of Teotihuacan on the civilizations that succeeded it was profound precisely because it was transmitted through dispersed populations rather than through the continued operation of a centralized political authority. The Toltec civilization, which emerged as a major power in central Mexico in the 9th and 10th centuries, shows deep Teotihuacan influence in its religious iconography and its political organization, and the Aztec civilization that followed the Toltecs incorporated Teotihuacan traditions through multiple generations of transmission and transformation. The specific religious traditions that the Aztecs expressed in their great temple in Tenochtitlan, the paired temples to the sun god Huitzilopochtli and the rain god Tlaloc, reflect the same pairing of solar and water deities that organized the ceremonial core of Teotihuacan 2,000 years before. Whatever the specific combination of causes, the aftermath of the collapse was a dramatic and permanent reduction in the city's size and importance. The population, which had stood at perhaps 100,000 or more at the height, declined to a few tens of thousands in the post-collapse period, and the city never again served as the dominant power of central Mexico. The broader Mesoamerican system that had been organized around Teotihuacan's commercial and political dominance was restructured in the following centuries, with new regional powers emerging to fill the vacuum that the collapse had created, and the specific cultural and religious traditions that Teotihuacan had developed and spread across Mesoamerica were transformed and reinterpreted by the succeeding civilizations that absorbed and adapted them. The Aztecs, who encountered the ruins of Teotihuacan in the 14th century when they were establishing themselves in the basin of Mexico, were profoundly affected by the site and incorporated it into their own cosmological and historical framework in ways that shaped both their identity and their understanding of the past. The Aztec name Teotihuacan, the place where men become gods or where the gods were born, reflects the specific interpretation they gave to the ruins. A sacred place of divine origin, the location where the current world had been created at the beginning of the current cosmic era. In the Aztec creation myth recorded in the colonial period, the gods had gathered at Teotihuacan after the destruction of the previous world sun, and two of them had thrown themselves into the fire to become the new sun and moon, sacrificing themselves to set the heavens in motion. This myth, which may preserve genuine ancient traditions about the site's religious significance, established Teotihuacan as the foundational sacred location of the Mesoamerican world, the place from which all subsequent civilization derived its legitimacy. The specific objects that the Aztec priests deposited at Teotihuacan as offerings are an extraordinary archaeological record of what the Aztecs considered sacred from the ancient past. The offerings include objects of great antiquity, some of them from periods centuries before the Aztec state existed, that appear to have been collected as relics of the ancient civilizations that the Aztecs regarded as their predecessors and sources of legitimacy. Olmec jade objects, Gulf Coast ceramics, and materials from across Mesoamerica appear in the Aztec offerings at the Teotihuacan pyramids, alongside freshly made Aztec objects in traditional styles, creating deposits that are part museum collection and part active religious offering. The Aztec understanding of history as a continuous chain of civilizations, each inheriting and transforming the sacred traditions of its predecessors, is expressed in material form in these deposits, and the specific choice of Teotihuacan as the site for this kind of relic offering reflects the place of the ancient city at the apex of the Aztec historical imagination. The Aztec rulers conducted pilgrimages to Teotihuacan and deposited offerings at the pyramids, and the objects they deposited, which have been found by archaeologists in excavations of the pyramids, represent a remarkable collection of ancient Mesoamerican materials, including objects hundreds of years old at the time of their deposition, that the Aztec priests had apparently collected as sacred relics of the ancient civilization. The Aztec engagement with Teotihuacan was therefore not simply a matter of giving a name to some ruins. It was a continuous and active religious relationship with a sacred place whose power they sought to appropriate and whose example they saw as the model for their own civilization's greatness. The Aztec creation myth that was set at Teotihuacan, the story of the sacrifice of two gods to create the sun and moon at the beginning of the current cosmic age, gave the city a foundational significance for Aztec civilization that went beyond archaeological interest or political symbolism. If the world began at Teotihuacan, then the legitimacy of any political order that claimed to maintain the world depended on its connection to that place. The Aztec state was organized around the maintenance of cosmic order through ritual sacrifice, and the specific claim that this cosmic order had originated at Teotihuacan, in the sacrifice of divine beings at the dawn of the current world, gave the city a permanent place in Aztec political theology that made pilgrimage to its pyramids not merely pious but politically necessary. The emperor who neglected Teotihuacan was the emperor who neglected the origin of the world his state claimed to maintain. The Aztec state was in many ways a conscious attempt to recreate the achievements of Teotihuacan, to build a new city of the gods in the same basin where the original had stood, and the specific forms of Aztec political and religious culture show the deep influence of the Teotihuacan tradition that the Aztecs had absorbed and transformed. The modern investigation of Teotihuacan began in earnest in the early 20th century with the work of Manuel Gamio, whose excavations in the 1910s established the first systematic archaeological knowledge of the site, and whose vision of Teotihuacan as a symbol of Mexico's indigenous heritage shaped the site's role in Mexican national identity. Gamio's work was as much a political as a scientific project. Working in the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution, which had overthrown the Porfirian dictatorship partly in the name of the indigenous and mestizo majority that had been marginalized by the Europeanizing policies of the previous era. Gamio saw the investigation and restoration of Teotihuacan as a contribution to the project of constructing a new Mexican national identity rooted in indigenous civilization rather than European heritage. The restoration of the Pyramid of the Moon and parts of the Street of the Dead that Gamio conducted, using techniques that would not meet modern conservation standards, but that created the visible monument that is the basis for much of the popular image of the site, was intended to make Teotihuacan accessible as a symbol of national greatness to the Mexican public that Gamio hoped would find in it a source of pride and identity. The subsequent decades of investigation, culminating in the Teotihuacan Mapping Project directed by René Millen from the 1960s to the 1980s, transformed the understanding of the site from a collection of dramatic monuments to a comprehensively planned city of extraordinary scale. Millen's project, which combined systematic surface survey, aerial photography, and the compilation of all existing archaeological information into a comprehensive map of the site, revealed for the first time the full extent of the urban grid, the distribution of the apartment compounds, and the overall organization of the city as a planned urban system. The Millen map remains the fundamental reference document for the spatial understanding of the site and has provided the organizational framework for virtually all subsequent research. The most dramatic recent development in Teotihuacan archaeology has been the discovery and investigation of the tunnel beneath the Ciudadela, the great enclosed precinct at the south end of the ceremonial core that contained the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. The tunnel, first detected by remote sensing in 2003 and systematically explored by Sergio Gomez Chavez from 2009 onward, extends approximately 100 meters from an entrance shaft at the center of the Ciudadela's plaza to a series of chambers at the far end, the largest of which has yielded an extraordinary collection of ritual deposits including liquid mercury, pyrite mirrors, miniature figurines, seeds, bones, and the remains of what appear to be elaborate dedicatory ceremonies. The investigation of the Ciudadela tunnel has been one of the most technically sophisticated archaeological projects ever conducted in Mexico, involving not only traditional excavation methods but a suite of remote sensing, chemical analysis, and three-dimensional documentation techniques that have allowed the recovery and analysis of fragile and complex deposits that would have been impossible to investigate with earlier methods. The use of a robot vehicle equipped with cameras and sensors to survey the tunnel before human investigators entered it, which produced the first images of the tunnel's intact contents and generated the public excitement that accompanied the announcement of the discovery, was itself a significant methodological innovation that demonstrated the potential of robotic technology for archaeological investigation in confined and environmentally sensitive spaces. The tunnel has not yet produced the royal burials that many archaeologists hoped it might contain, but the scale of the ritual deposits and the specific character of the objects recovered have significantly advanced the understanding of the ritual dimensions of the Ciudadela complex and of the specific cosmological framework that the Teotihuacan elite expressed in their most important ceremonial context. The investigation of the Teotihuacan tunnel is part of a broader renewal of research at the site that has transformed the understanding of the city in the first decades of the 21st century, as a new generation of Mexican archaeologists has applied the full range of modern scientific methods to questions that earlier research had identified but not fully answered. The isotopic analysis of skeletal remains that has revealed the geographic origins of individuals buried at the site, the chemical fingerprinting of ceramics that has mapped the distribution of Teotihuacan pottery across Mesoamerica, the remote sensing surveys that have produced new maps of the city's buried features, and the genetic analysis of ancient DNA from compound burials that is beginning to illuminate the biological relationships between individuals. All of these contribute to a picture of Teotihuacan that is dramatically richer than the one available even 20 years ago. The city that was known primarily from its pyramids and its murals is revealing itself, through the patient application of science to its buried remains, as a place of extraordinary human complexity whose story extends far beyond the monumental core into the daily lives of the hundreds of thousands of people who made it the greatest city in the ancient Americas. The mercury found in the Ciudadela tunnel is one of the most striking of the many remarkable discoveries from that excavation, and its presence in a ritual context is a reminder of how the Teotihuacan civilization used the remarkable geological resources of Mexico in ways that were simultaneously practical, aesthetic, and sacred. Liquid mercury does not occur naturally in the basin of Mexico and must have been obtained from distant cinnabar deposits, suggesting either that the Teotihuacan trade networks extended to mercury sources in what is now Querétaro or Guerrero, or that mercury was obtained through exchange with cultures that had direct access to those sources. The quantities involved, enough to fill sections of the tunnel floor with a shallow layer of the reflective liquid, represent a significant material investment and imply a specific ritual purpose. The most likely interpretation is that the mercury was intended to represent a body of water, a symbolic underworld sea or lake that the tunnel as a whole represented as an underworld space, consistent with the Mesoamerican understanding of caves and underground passages as portals to the world below. This interpretation connects the Ciudadela tunnel to the cave beneath the Pyramid of the Sun in a single cosmological framework, in which the underground spaces beneath the city's two greatest ceremonial complexes were both understood as portals to the underworld and as the specific locations through which the sacred power of the earth was accessed and maintained. The city's ceremonial core was not simply a collection of impressive buildings, but a carefully constructed cosmological landscape, every element of which was positioned and designed to express a specific understanding of the relationship between the human world, the earth, and the divine powers that governed the cosmos. The pyrite mirrors found in the tunnel are another category of object that connects the practical, the aesthetic, and the sacred in the characteristic manner of Teotihuacan material culture. The specific assemblage of objects in the Ciudadela tunnel, taken as a whole, presents a picture of a ritual tradition of extraordinary sophistication, one in which the physical properties of natural materials, the reflectivity of mercury, the sharpness of obsidian, the green color of jade that associated it with water and vegetation and precious things, were understood as the visible expression of sacred qualities that connected the material world to the divine. The Teotihuacan craftspeople who made the objects deposited in the tunnel were not simply producing useful things. They were producing containers of sacred power, objects whose specific materials and specific forms gave them a ritual efficacy that transcended their physical properties. The tunnel itself, as a portal to the underworld and a space of concentrated sacred power, was the appropriate location for the accumulation of these objects, and the specific selection of what was deposited, and what was not, reflects a ritual logic that we can partially reconstruct but cannot fully recover. The question of whether the tunnel contains royal burials remains open. The excavation of the terminal chambers at the end of the tunnel, which have not yet been fully investigated, may or may not produce the kind of elite burial deposits that would definitively resolve the question of whether Teotihuacan had individual rulers of the Maya type. What the tunnel has already produced is sufficient to establish it as one of the most important ritual spaces yet documented in Teotihuacan, and the ongoing analysis of its contents is among the most significant current contributions to the understanding of this extraordinary civilization. Pyrite mirrors were among the most prestigious objects in Mesoamerica, their reflective surfaces used for divination, for seeing into the supernatural world, and as markers of elite status. Their deposition in the ritual context of the Ciudadela tunnel places them within the specific cosmological framework of the underground space and connects the ritual uses of mirrors in the surface world to the underground world that the tunnel represented. The experience of visiting Teotihuacan today, as one of the most visited archaeological sites in Mexico and one of the most recognized ancient places in the world, is an experience that mixes genuine wonder at the physical scale of the monuments with the specific challenges of encountering an ancient city that has been partially restored for tourism and that receives millions of visitors per year. The pyramids, approached from the south along the Street of the Dead, are as impressive today as they have ever been. The sheer scale of the Pyramid of the Sun revealed as you walk toward it in a gradual expansion of perspective that makes the structure appear larger the closer you come, rather than smaller as most distant objects do. The ability to climb to the summit of the Pyramid of the Sun, which is permitted at Teotihuacan in a way that is no longer permitted at many ancient sites, gives an experience of elevation and panoramic view that was clearly part of the intended experience of the original builders. The view from the summit extending in all directions to the ring of mountains that encloses the Valley of Mexico and giving a sense of the city's relationship to the larger landscape that cannot be obtained from any other vantage point. The Street of the Dead itself, when approached on foot from the Pyramid of the Moon looking south, reveals the spatial intelligence of the original planners in a way that the aerial photographs that dominate popular images of the site cannot convey. The alignment of the axis, the way each successive platform level frames the view ahead, the specific proportions of the open spaces between the buildings. These are not accidental but are the result of deliberate design choices made 2,000 years ago, and the experience of walking through a space that was designed this carefully and that has survived this completely is one of the most profound encounters with ancient architecture available anywhere in the world. The apartment compounds scattered across the site offer a different kind of encounter with the ancient city. The preserved murals in the Tetetla, Atatelco, and Tepantitla compounds give a direct sense of the visual environment in which the city's inhabitants lived and worshipped, their flat, confident line and saturated colors communicating an aesthetic sensibility that is utterly distinctive and that was as characteristic of Teotihuacan as the pyramid profiles dominating the site's popular image. The morning light at Teotihuacan, when the site opens before the first tour buses arrive and the pyramids are visible in the raking light that reveals the texture of their stone surfaces and the specific quality of the ochre and red pigments that still adhere to some sections of the facades, has a quality of temporal depth that the crowded midday cannot provide. The specific quality of attention that Teotihuacan demands is different from what other ancient sites require. At sites with written records, the visitor can be told who built the temples and what they were for and what the people who used them believed. At Teotihuacan, the visitor is given the physical facts and left to make of them what they can. The pyramids are real. The alignment to the Pleiades is real. The sacrifices at the Temple of the Feathered Serpent were real. The remains of the people killed there are still in the ground. The mercury in the tunnel is real. These are facts without a story, evidence without a narrator, and the imagination must supply what the record does not. This is not a limitation that will be overcome by further excavation. It is the fundamental condition of our relationship to this civilization, and learning to engage with it honestly, to find the city extraordinary precisely because of what is not known rather than in spite of it, is one of the things that Teotihuacan offers that no other ancient place on earth quite replicates. Teotihuacan is also, in the 21st century, a living cultural site for the millions of Mexicans for whom it is a symbol of indigenous heritage and civilizational achievement. The site receives more than 4 million visitors per year, making it one of the most visited cultural sites in Latin America, and the specific experience it offers, the combination of massive physical scale, visual splendor, and the productive silence of an unknown civilization, creates an encounter with the past that is simultaneously humbling and empowering, a reminder that the territory of Mexico was home to civilizations of extraordinary complexity long before the arrival of European contact, and that the heritage of those civilizations belongs to the present as much as to the past. At sites with written records, the visitor can be told who built the temples and what they were for and what the people who used them believed. At Teotihuacan, the visitor is given the physical facts and left to make of them what they can. The pyramids are real. The alignment to the Pleiades is real. The sacrifices at the Temple of the Feathered Serpent were real. The remains of the people killed there are still in the ground. The mercury in the tunnel is real. These are facts without a story, evidence without a narrator, and the imagination must supply what the record does not. This is not a limitation that will be overcome by further excavation. It is the fundamental condition of our relationship to this civilization, and learning to engage with it honestly, to find the city extraordinary precisely because of what is not known rather than in spite of it, is one of the things that Teotihuacan offers that no other ancient place on earth quite replicates. The city that stood here, housing 100,000 people, producing obsidian tools and ceramic vessels, and the murals that are now preserved in the site museum, trading with Maya lords 1,000 kilometers to the south. It is not gone. It is here, in the stones and the plaster and the alignment of the streets, in the cave beneath the largest pyramid and the tunnel beneath the temple, in the offerings buried under floors and in the ash from the fires that ended the city's greatness. It requires only the right quality of attention to hear it. The specific silence of Teotihuacan at dawn, before the vendors arrive and before the crowds fill the street of the dead, has a quality that belongs to a place whose story is not yet fully told. The mystery at the center of the city, the absence of the names and the language and the stories of the people who built it, is not a gap in the knowledge that archaeology will eventually fill. Some things about Teotihuacan may never be known. If the city had a writing system, it has not been found in a form that allows decipherment. If the builders left an account of themselves, it has not survived. The specific quality of the silence that greets the dawn visitor to the street of the dead is the silence of genuine unknowing, of a civilization that was real and powerful and sophisticated, and that nonetheless has left a blank at the center of its record where the names and the voices should be. This absence, which would be simply a limitation in any other context, becomes something different when experienced in the physical presence of the monuments. The Pyramid of the Sun does not need a name attached to it to communicate the ambition and the intelligence and the labor of the people who built it. The Street of the Dead does not need the ritual speeches that were once delivered along its processional length to communicate the spatial intelligence that designed it. The murals of the great goddess do not need the specific prayers addressed to her to communicate the depth of religious feeling that produced them. The city speaks without words, in the language of stone and plaster and alignment and scale, and the specific quality of that speechless communication is one of the things that makes Teotihuacan unlike any other ancient site in the Americas. The dawn light on the Pyramid of the Sun, the shadow of the structure falling across the Street of the Dead in a line that the original builders may have calculated to fall precisely where it falls on specific days of the astronomical calendar, is a physical fact that has been repeated every morning for 2,000 years, regardless of whether anyone was present to observe it. The city has been continuing its relationship with the sun and the stars and the movement of the seasons without any human attention for centuries. The cave beneath the pyramid is still there, still oriented to the cardinal directions, still the underground chamber over which the largest structure in the Western Hemisphere was built as an act of cosmological statement. What the builders of Teotihuacan understood about the cave, and about the specific relationship between the underground space and the monument built above it, cannot be fully known. But the specific act of building the largest pyramid in the Western Hemisphere over a natural cave that was understood as a place of creation is not an act that can be explained by practical considerations or by coincidence. It is an act of cosmological statement, an assertion that this place is where the world began, that this city is the place from which the current cosmic order derives its foundation. Whether that assertion was believed literally, as a theological fact, or deployed strategically, as a political claim, or held somewhere in the complex space between the literal and the symbolic that characterizes most human religious experience, it was made with the full resources of the civilization that made it, with the labor of tens of thousands of workers and the vision of the planners who laid out the grid and calculated the alignments. 2,000 years later, the statement endures, in stone and in alignment and in the specific orientation of a cave that a civilization chose to declare the center of the world. When the first visitors of the day begin their ascent of the southern staircase, they are entering a space that was designed for exactly this kind of approach, by people whose names are unknown but whose intelligence and vision are written in every stone of the structure they left behind. If this documentary has kept you company through the night, consider subscribing so you never miss the next quiet journey. And if you are ready for another story from the ancient world, there is one waiting for you on the screen now.